Welcome to the Salience podcast, where we identify what stands out from all the noise.
This season on the Salience podcast, we have been exploring culture across broad areas such as management and organization, learning, and abuse and domestic violence. In this episode, I wanted to focus specifically on culture as a topic. Today, we have with us researcher and visual artist Nurul Huda Rashid. Nurul is currently pursuing her PhD in Cultural Studies in Asia at the National University of Singapore, and we will be discussing what it means to do cultural studies. Nurul's research explores the role of algorithms in the study of Muslim women images. Her current project, Women in War, is a survey of images of women in war critiqued through lenses of gender and violence, politics of the visual, and the roles of the algorithm and archive as methods. So we will be getting a double feature on this episode as we also venture into the burgeoning space of generative AI. Nurul analyzes how images of culture are produced, consumed, and made through aspects of image reproduction, automation, computerisation, annotation, and articulation. In this session, we will discuss how culture, technology, and AI can be understood together. We will get into juicy questions like, does AI have a culture? And how can we build more ethical AI? Welcome, Nurul, to the Salience podcast.
Hi, Daitun. Thanks for having me.
Now, so Nurul and I have been friends for a very long time, so it's really nice to have her here. So I know this, but it'd be good to share with the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you became who you are. What are some of your own cultural influences?
Thank you, Chen. So Chen and I kind of go way back. We met when we were in our undergrad days and doing our masters. And I think for me, my masters was kind of the starting point to this big investigation of looking at images. And a lot of it is also influenced by my own background as someone who is what I would identify as a double minority in Singapore, being both Indian and Muslim. In a country like Singapore where race and religion are very specifically categorized into demographic classifications. So for me, as someone who is a double minority, I started to, use my experiences and articulate it through photography as a way to kind of think about how the image becomes a medium of storytelling, how the image can become a medium of relaying information. So in that sense, in talking about cultural influences, it was kind of the meeting point between my growing up experiences to the different tools or the different mediums that has allowed me to navigate the kind of work that I do. I also very early on in my young days identified as an intersectional feminist, being someone who is constantly angry and trying to always find a venue or kind of a community with which I could articulate some issues or problems in society. And at the same time, I think for me, art becomes a huge cultural influence in terms of how I navigate the way in which I think about meaning. Art being something that is very much institutionalized, but also volatile. And I think this will lead into the larger discussions of AI and art later as well. I think the space of the art has allowed me to kind of think about how I could not just navigate, but create new meaning in terms of how I would identify myself as a double minority or how I identify myself as feminist. And I think, all these different cultural influences has kind of culminated towards this big research that I'm doing in my PhD. And in that sense, it has been like a 10-year lead up to where I am now. So, I think all of this kind of creates different positions that I inhabit in relation to the different circles I operate within, be it in the art scene in Singapore, in academia, at the same time also in relation to activist groups and work that I do.
Wow. So even in that short introduction, I feel like you've touched on all these different points of culture that, we really want to dig into things like power, representation, sort of structural organization of different identities. It's really juicy. A lot of our audience are working in a space where culture has become a really huge focus in their organizations. So I want to unpack culture a little more with someone who has chosen to focus on this in a more rigorous way, because a lot of times when we think about organizations and we think about organizational culture, right, it sort of borrows a lot of concepts from cultural studies, but we've never really, gone back to the source to talk about what it means. So I'd love to expand a little on how culture is actually understood in cultural studies, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because in my master's, I majored in anthropology, and anthropology has a very specific way in terms of how they approach culture, in that sense that it's very ethnographic. So the process is that you would go into the ground, you would collect information, and a lot of the times it's about the anthropologist or the researcher looking, observing, and then documenting, right? What would then be kind of collated into ethnography and therefore identify as the culture of that particular space or that particular group of people. And I think for me, then moving into cultural studies in my PhD, I realized that the process or the definition of culture has kind of shifted based on these different disciplines or fields of study, where anthropology kind of creates a capture or a snapshot of what culture is. In cultural studies, the idea or the definition of culture is an ongoing process, in the sense that every act of discussing culture becomes a new formulation of what becomes the components, the context, the history, the different cultural moments, be it structures of power, hegemony, ground movements. So basically how all of this can become different conjunctures or like combination of events that would create that culture. So for me, the significant shift is evident in the difference of culture as a snapshot versus culture as an ongoing formulation. So for me, in the cultural studies perspective has kind of shifted how I also started looking at culture, right? In a sense that at every point in time, there's always a need to formulate or identify and define that culture based on the tangential events that's happening, the existing structures of power that's governing, and at the same time, of course, responding to the snapshots, right? So I think for cultural studies, we very much follow in the footsteps of Stuart Hall, and a great book that he wrote about policing the crisis, marking the state and law and order, works on this idea of conjunctural analysis, where you look at different conjunctures, or basically like different combination of events that would create a cultural moment. So in that sense, every definition of culture would be very different based on the different time periods that we're looking at, based on the different researchers or the different persons who are coming in. And at the same time, also based on the different formulations that they engage with. So I think for me, moving into this cultural studies perspective of how we think about culture becomes a more colorful, for lack of a better word, way of knowing and understanding that culture is also constantly changing. So I think, furthermore, as I'm also in the program that focuses specifically on Asia, it also shifts away from the West as an epicenter in terms of how we think about culture or how we reference certain theories, for example. So a lot of our discussions of culture also revolves around what it means to decolonize, to de-imperialize. And I know these are all kind of big terms in theory, but a lot of the times this also is discussed in relation to your positionality. And I think for me, as someone who was working in cultural studies, but also someone who has worked on the ground a lot with different communities, positionality becomes a very important factor in discussing culture, because who you are, what positions you take, be it in an organization, be it in a particular community, be it in an art space, it will very much shape what are the events and what are the moments that you would use in your combination of what becomes culture. So I hope that kind of gives an overview of, in thinking about how culture is something that's really very organic. And I think it doesn't need to move away from this idea that culture is fixed based on the snapshots or based on this like documentation. Because the danger in that is also how that can be used and replicated as a model. And especially for organizations, if they only continuously reuse those models of what they think is a culture of a particular group of people or a particular site, it can be outdated. It can be something that would be a form of misinformation. It can be something that might not allow them to really closely relate to the people or communities whom they're working with. Yeah.
Okay, wow. So you've used like a combination of different things there. I just wanted to maybe break it down and ask you for some examples. So you've talked about a combination of events, right? Maybe utilizing some of your research as an example, like what specific combinations are you looking at, and how can that help to unpack the concept a bit?
So I think currently the research on my PhD dissertation that I'm looking at, new images of Muslim women, would be a really good example, because traditionally, and I use traditionally in relation to like, if we think of it as an ethnographic documentation, we might think like, all right, I'm going to study Muslim women in Singapore, for example, and then I'm going to interview them and talk to them, etc. Right? And fine, that does give you an overview of a culture, but what I'm doing in my research is to identify kind of the whole kind of a historical lineage to how this term or this being or this identity of Muslim women has come about. So, looking at early periods of modernity, where the camera was brought from France to parts of the Middle East, and how it documented images of women, veiled women or the Arab women. And in a sense, the Orientalist fantasy created a trope that was then disseminated or circulated into colonial postcards. And in that sense, how this particular trope continued in relation to the new circulation in news media. So in that sense, identifying the event of early periods of colonialism to the event of news media circulation, and then looking later at how images moving in search engine becomes another particular kind of event, and how all of this culminates towards the wider discussion or the wider identity of what makes up the Muslim women. So, in thinking about what is then this culture of Muslim women based on these different events, I start to recognize, or I start to identify how, based on these events, which utilize particular technologies, which would have distinct politics, be it, politics of representation in terms of, how the Orientalist fantasy would always see the Muslim women as the Orient other, and how, with post 9/11 as an event, the rise of Islamophobia framed Muslim women who wore the hijab in a particular way, and how all of this culminates towards a wider imagination of how we think about the culture of Muslim women now. So for me, the being able to identify what are these different events and components, and then bridging them together to think about, all right, so this is what it's trying to say, and this is what manifests into this notion of culture of Muslim women.
So, sort of my thinking and unpacking of what you've said there is almost like that there is an inevitable subjectivity in how culture is sort of reproduced, understood, and sort of consumed and reproduced again, therefore, right? So in that subjectivity, what is the way we can work toward creating a more holistic representation, a beat of people, of groups of people or events? I mean, what are some ways we can do that? Because at the end of the day, right? I mean, we recognize that. And one of my favorite quotes is by Anais Nin: "We don't see the world as it is; we see the world as we are." Right. So recognizing that is critical. But then, what are some maybe tips and tricks that people can use to make sure that there is a more holistic representation of what they recognize as always a subjective representation?
I think that's really hard to merge and separate at the same time, because I think whenever we talk about subjectivity, we can't deny the fact that everyone's subjectivity is different based on the positions that we inhabit, right? And I think to also talk about a holistic definition or view of culture can also be problematic, because a lot of the times I think when we discuss one of the reasons why colonialism, like historical colonialism, has become such an important agent in the discussion of decolonialism is because it tried to create a holistic culture, right? It tried to kind of enforce the imagination or, the reality, a very quote unquote Western reality of like what they thought culture should be like. And so for me, I think the idea of the holistic, I can understand the importance of it, in terms of how, for organizations, for example, in wanting to get a good overview in order to think about how can we include everybody? How can we ensure that we're not excluding any groups, any voices? So in a sense, I understand the meaning of holistic in that sense. But I think it's also important to note that when we discuss the holistic, it also kind of means that there has to be an objective view, right? Like in a sense, I kind of wonder where can subjectivity come in terms of that, because I think for me, subjectivity in itself should be a starting point. So to understand like what is the position that the organization is taking, what are their frameworks of reference that they're bringing in. So for example, if you let me share an example of some work that I did. So I used to work with Aware, which is a women's organization here in Singapore, and we wanted, so it is an organization that focuses on women in Singapore. And women in Singapore means that it consists of different ethnic groups, women from different socioeconomic status, and therefore it was really hard to determine, like with a brushstroke, like what would be like a holistic perspective that we would have on this. So in that sense, I think incorporating the different subjectivities became really important, right? So when we wanted to begin a sex education workshop focusing on young Muslim women, like young Muslim girls, we had to, within Aware, which is kind of an organization that works for all women, we had to kind of segment off, all right, we're gonna pool resources to now focus on this one small minority group, right? So firstly, we started to think about, okay, what are the existing using your term, what are the existing holistic frameworks that we have used within the organization now? So those are things that we brought into as a starting point, right? Into the design of these workshops for this small minority group. But then we started to also change. We started to like, all right, so what are the things that we can tweak? What are the particular, basically, so when we think about what's the subjectivity of being a Muslim woman, Islam becomes a huge factor in it, because when we talk about sex in Islam, it would differ from what would otherwise be deemed as, for lack of a better word, mainstream. So things like premarital sex, there are different stands on that with regards to Islam, right? For example. So we also talked about, when we talk about consent, all right, consent in good relationships, those are things that we can bring from a holistic perspective. But other things were tweaked and redesigned based on the subjectivity of that Muslim perspective. So I think it's important, I guess because I'm a very visual person, the image I'm seeing in my head now is, for example, if you have a whole big circle, which is your organization, and that's kind of your holistic overview of culture, right? Of the community you're working with, for example. I think it's also important to recognize that it is necessary or possible to have other smaller circles which would reflect different subjectivities of different cultural understandings. And I think, it's important to then note that you're not just copy pasting everything, but each subjectivity is allowed to manifest in and of itself. So that's kind of the image I can kind of visualize in thinking of how we can combine the holistic and the subjectivity.
No, that's the reason why I asked that is because I think it's one of the fundamental tensions, right? Be it whether the organization is government, whether it's like a private organization or a nonprofit working with community, right? Is that there's still a need to sometimes cultivate or develop some kind of policy. And policy needs to create some kind of a baseline or umbrella through which subjectivities can manifest and make sense within. So it's really trying to understand the tension, right? How do organizations effectively manage that tension for needing some kind of a policy framework to hang it on without discounting the need to attend to subjectivities?
I think it's important to also maybe reposition subjectivity not as something that is in contradiction to like the wider policy, because I know with things like cultural policy, any kind of policy, there is a necessity to understand like what is the majority perspective on this in order to then render it a policy, right? So that hopefully it can impact as many people as possible. But at the same time, I think especially when a lot of the times, if we think about the developmental framework, it is also coming from a particular regional or like a what is identified as a global north, right? And then in that sense, when we're now moving into places such as the global south, it has its own subjectivity. So how do we now reposition these policies in relation to that? So I think it has to kind of be a collaboration almost. And I think in order to allow for that collaborative space to happen, it has to then boil back down to being able to identify, recognize who are the people you're working with, what are their what are their voices, how do they articulate, how do they speak, how do they basically perform, and their culture, and to use all of this as a way to breach into how we think about policy making.
I love that. It's again, I think what you're talking about here is the importance of recognizing one's own positionality within the systems that we're navigating, isn't it? Yeah. Very cool. So I want to now move a little bit into your research because it's a very interesting space, and I believe that you're pioneering the space a little bit. Could you describe the work you're doing for our listeners, please?
Wow. Yeah. So it's interesting how when you're writing your dissertation, everything is kind of in your head, but when you have to speak about it, it just comes a bit jumbled. So just a bit of a warning there. So my research is looking at images of Muslim women in the data turn. And for me, the context of the data turn, in a sense, is when we start to realize that, with Smart Nation, with the introduction of iPhones, everything becomes data. All our information becomes data that is then used by companies like Google for market research, right? So basically, everything, in a sense, we are all data. We all become data selves. So I wanted to look at how images of Muslim women are circulated within this data movement, this data turn. So I started looking at images of Muslim women and how it's automated by 3 different search engines, namely Google, Baidu, and Yandex. And I picked these 3 search engines because I wanted to kind of look at the geographies of different search engines. Google being Google is international, but it's also largely kind of US based. With Baidu being a Chinese search engine that is very much economical market for the market, and with Yandex as a Russian search engine. So for me, I wanted to look at how images of Muslim women are circulated based on these different search engines, and I found that with Google, it is largely a post 9/11 narrative. There are, for lack of a better word, positive and negative images, in a sense, borrowing from the earlier trope of Muslim women as the oppressed, or Muslim women as the terrorized that we see in post 9/11. We also see it being circulated in Google. But at the same time, Google also features positive images of Muslim women, and positive images are basically women being active, doing sports, supposedly defying this trope of the oppressed. But what I found with my research is that even though Google shows a lot of positive images, these images are still circulated within articles that talk about that continues that post 9/11 narrative, whereby they're like, look, Muslim women are trying to do better. This is the positive representation of Muslim women doing sports. Like, yay, we are doing well. And in that sense, even though the images show a positive representation, it is nevertheless still etched in a post 9/11 paradigm. So the same goes for Yandex, which unfortunately, Yandex interestingly has a lot of beautiful images of Muslim women, but and a lot of it is gathered from places like Pinterest. So we can allude to this as like, wow, it's positive self-representation because Muslim women are taking photos of themselves and they're putting it up there for themselves, by themselves. But then a lot of these images are also unfortunately circulated in a lot of sex websites. So in that sense, for me, I wanted to kind of look at how these images are circulated and where they're circulated. Because for me, it says a lot about this perception that is being kind of dictated by this automation of search engines about the Muslim women image, about the Muslim women identity, and then largely about how we think about the Muslim women as like an ongoing culture. So as a response to that, the second part of my thesis is then looking at responses and activations. So I look a bit at how digital feminist artists use AI in their work to augment, to manipulate. And then I also engage with self-identified Muslim women in Singapore in participatory action research workshops where they get to bring in all the images that I kind of looked at in my search engine portion, and they start to talk about like, why are these images here? What does it say about us? And then they also respond with their own narration of how they see themselves. So I think it is interesting how with Singapore, a lot of the identity of Muslim women is still very much related to a Nusantara or a Malay archipelago geographical identity, which is something that is not featured in search engines. So I think for me, my research, I'm trying to look at where is the representation, where it is not, who is featured, who is not, and at the same time to kind of look at how all these different technologies are using different structures of power and different kind of devices to circulate, to automate the Muslim women image. So that's kind of a short overview of the research I'm currently doing.
I mean, it's fascinating, and I know you started this work some years ago, but it's I feel like you are publishing your thesis, at the right moment in time. So I feel like the universe has conspired to bring about this particular conjecture for you, because there is a burst of interest right now in the space of generative AI. You have ChatGPT-4 gaining a lot of traction. You have image generation AIs like Midjourney and all that there's been a lot of debate around, right? So, I mean, based on your research and based on your sort of personal position as an artist as well, what do you see are the implications of some of your findings, right? In the way images are being generated, couched within specific narratives that are linked to specific points in time, wanting to advance a specific identity of a group of people, or it could be an idea, right? It's quite a powerful thing because of the reproductive proliferation of these types of tools. So what do you think are some of the implications that we need to be aware of?
I think for platforms such as like ChatGPT, Midjourney, all these AI tools, right? I think an important component, especially with regards to AI image making tools, even like AI Picasso, for example, there is this huge, I think there's now this huge focus on computer vision. So computer vision, as opposed to human vision. So for us, when we think about human vision is what we see optically, and then how we then classify. And a lot of it is also very much culture, right? Like culture kind of helps to give us kind of an like tools or categories or kind of, what is it called, frameworks of how we would see and define certain things and how we name stuff. So computer vision does the same thing, except that with computer vision, it is interesting because with computer vision, so for me, when I was looking at the images in the different search engines, I also realized that in the algorithmic AI, computer vision sees Muslim women as someone who wears a hijab. So the hijab is the veil. And any image of a woman who doesn't wear a hijab would not be recognized necessarily as Muslim women. So from that in itself, I kind of noticed that there's a particular learning that, or conditioning, or I don't know, formulaic equation that the computer vision has been assigned an image to the term Muslim women, right? So, in human vision or in reality, we know that's also not true because there are Muslim women who choose to not don the hijab. But then in that sense, we see that online or, algorithmically, they are not represented. So I don't want to say that it is problematic. But at the same time, I think it is more about who is omitted, and what does it mean, or what's the implication of being omitted from data representation? Because for me, on one hand, it is good to be represented on data because it means then that technology can have a better understanding of how you would talk about market research, etc. But at the same time, I think there's also it's also scary if you're fully represented as data, because it means that you have become datafied, right? That you can be easily coded. But I mean, with works by Ruha Benjamin, Sophia Nobel, they talk about how in America, data selves of the Black community is not well documented, which is why there's all this misrepresentation, there's discrimination, and that's why they call the algorithm as a form of oppression, because it is not able to properly capture, right? So, for me, this boils down to kind of how we think about what we're using computer vision for, because on one hand, yes, it is important to have proper representation, but at the same time, proper representation can also lead to things like surveillance. So one of the things that I've also been wondering about is when I bought my most recent iPhone, I was like, oh my gosh, it actually captures my skin color better because I'm brown, right? Because earlier phones would kind of whitewash me and make my skin look like fairer than what I am. But then at the same time, I was like, does this then mean that facial recognition AI can better recognize my skin color? And is that a good or a bad thing? So, I think when we start to think about all these new platforms and all these generative AI platforms, like Midjourney and AI Picasso, and how they kind of have a particular mode of creating images out of an amalgamation of other kinds of images. I don't know. I mean, there is the ethical issue of it, and then there's the ownership aspect of it. But I think for me, in thinking about it through a computer vision perspective, it reflects more on how we have kind of we have started to teach or condition computer vision in a particular way, and it is something that often mirrors our own human vision. So I'm not sure if I'm actually, explaining this really well, but basically, I feel that the implications of it is not just that AI is bad because it copies or it reproduces, but I strongly feel that the reason why it does so is because we have taught it to be so. Because for me, as much as human vision and computer vision are like separate, because in a sense, one's human, one's a cyborg, right, of sorts in a way. But I actually do feel that the reason why computer vision is such is because human vision is such. I feel that it's actually a sort of like, it mirrors each other. Because it's humans, it is us humans who kind of, computerize, and we kind of made this machine, and we enabled it to basically generate. And I mean, I know generate as a term can seem like a good thing, but sometimes I think it also has ills about it, because like, where are you generating from? Like, whose works are you generating from, and whom are you generating for? So, it makes it seem as if with generative AI, it allows itself, or it frees itself from ownership. And I think that has kind of caused a lot of problems for artists, where ownership is kind of the very crux of what it means to, become an artist, like your authenticity. And I think it also, goes back to this whole bigger discussion of like, who owns our data, right? Like, we just give everything to them and they can just reformulate or generate it however they want. So I think these are the issues that plague me with regards to kind of this generative AI platforms.
I mean, so again, this is such a new topic, right? So, and I think that's why it's so hard to articulate coherently, because it's changing just as we're speaking about it. But I completely agree with you. So we interviewed a friend and colleague who is currently the head of Novartis's Global Societal Learning, and they're investing a lot in this program called Beacon of Hope, where they're trying to get more representation from African Americans in America for clinical trials. Because, for example, one of the things that emerged is the oximeter that was distributed during COVID-19 doesn't pick up oxygen levels from darker skinned people. So that became a problem. But on the flip side, right, so in some other research that I have done for better anti-racism, in medical science, one of the things they say is, we don't want to be identified because that might impact on the way we are treated. So there is this really interesting tension. And I think that if I may sort of reframe that, as you've mentioned, it's scary because the AI is a mirror for us. It's mirroring how society is. It's mirroring our power structures and conflicts in sort of interests, and it's also mirroring all of the inequities that we see in our own society, right? So it's such a fascinating space. I want to ask you then, right? If you could make recommendations around, and this is another big space now, ethics of AI use and how it's not just used to create more algorithms, but how it's going to potentially become implemented in things like, government policy making, decision making, how organizations actually manage their people, right? What are some recommendations you might make to improve how these tools get utilized?
I mean, I feel like I might not be the right person, right, to speak on this, but in the sense of the earlier tension that you mentioned, in relation to data representation, for example, I think this also then goes back to the earlier discussion on positionality, right? Like the positions that you take, because I can see how, when we think about identity politics, when we think about groups of people wanting to be represented. So, for example, when Web 2.0 started, the participatory platforms of like social media allowed communities who would not have been able to kind of exist physically or kind of come together physically, they were able to do so on social media. And in that sense, we kind of think that, all right, with this new Web 3.0, or like the semantic web, which is kind of, it is kind of like a new beast, because it is not just about an uploading of images, but it is the neural networks of how these images are like circulated across not just one level, but many different levels. So in that sense, we kind of really have no control, because the AI in itself, it teaches itself, it's generative. So, this earlier need to kind of want to represent can happen, but I think we need to better understand how to do so, right? So, I mean, I wish that, I think data scientists might be the ones to have to do more research on this, maybe. But I'm also thinking, on an organizational level, a lot of the times we need to also think about, when do we not collect data, and also where is this data stored? So in a lot of there's this term called data colonialism, right? The whole idea, like now with historical colonialism, it was about going around extracting resources like land, minerals from different countries, but then now we're in this new wave where the extraction is that of data. So I feel that, with this new beast of the AI, and even in thinking about like the semantic web and how information is circulated and stored, we need to think about whose data are we collecting, for what reason, and how are we storing it. That for me would be like one of an important step in thinking about or ensuring that we're not contributing further to this automation of data, in the sense that, we're just putting it into the big wheel and it circulates, right? I think this is one of the things that I had a problem with, because initially, one of my chapters for my research, I wanted to look at facial AI recognition. And what I wanted to do was to upload images of Muslim women into the facial AI to kind of then see what the AI generated. But then I stopped myself and I asked, I'm like, oh my gosh, well, what if in contributing these images, I'm teaching the AI to better read Muslim women images, right? And that made me stop. Because it's a thing, and that's why I think I do not separate between us, the human, and the AI, because I do feel that it is a tool that mirrors who we are and the kind of culture that we have. But I as I mentioned, I don't feel that I might be the person to be able to give recommendations, but I think what I can outline like precautions, perhaps, or like parameters of thinking about the limits of how we approach AI, in the sense that it is not, there's this claim that the AI will save us or AI will destroy us, in all these futuristic movies, right? Like very apocalyptic, or how it's going to be something that will project us into the future with Smart Nation. But I think, the importance of of kind of putting a stop to all these kinds of imagination, and just I think realizing that at the end of the day, it is a tool. Yes, it is a very politically charged tool. It is also, in that lineage of the computational moment of like how we started from the brain as a computer to the actual computer to this AI, the whole history of it. Even for me, like the camera is a tool of making images. It can be used for good and bad, and the same with AI as well. So I think for me, instead of recommendations, it is more about like how can we position ourselves in terms of what we perceive of AI, right? How we perceive it. And then, with AI, it's not just generative platforms, but also in relation to algorithms, right? Like, what are the kinds of images that you want to put into the World Wide Web? So for me, in looking at images of Muslim women, I no longer want photojournalists, for example, to take photos of Muslim women crying in the Middle East, because within like the whole field of photojournalism, there is like huge canon of that already. It has become a trope, right? And then realizing that it is a trope that we have to fight against, because Muslim women are have been very vocal in a lot of movements within the Middle East, but it's often the image that kind of pulls you down. So when we think about what becomes a permanent, we think about what images don't you what are the kinds of images that you no longer need to put into circulation, right, of these neural networks. What other forms of data, right? Because like even things like hashtagging. I know a lot of the times, because I've done this as well when I was working with the women's organization. We did like an Instagram workshop where we engaged young participants to create a photo and then tell their story through that photo, because it was easier than them writing like a story, for example. And then they would use hashtags, etc., etc. So it's sometimes it might seem really minute, but I think it actually has a huge impact, because if we think about the AI as a learning tool, right? And if the statement holds that whatever happens in our reality, in our everyday, is something that we input into the AI. So then we need to think about what are we actually putting into it? How can we input something that's better, right? And I think this also then goes back down to like this earlier discussion of culture, right? So instead of just thinking of culture as a snapshot that we will then input into AI, which will then basically rehash the same thing, because what it does is that it will rehash, it will reify, it will basically give you the same thing. How can we maybe think of culture as something that is organic, that is changing, right? That can question, that can reframe. What are different events or moments that you might want to consider? So like, for example, if you're working with different communities, to engage them further in I think storytelling is such an important method, right? Because it allows you to move beyond the image. It allows you to move beyond all these tropes that we often see be circulated. So, for me, it has to kind of take, it takes different steps, but also many different steps, in first identifying what are we putting into all this new tool or the new technology of AI, and if we want to put in something different, how do we get to that different stories? And therefore, how can we now reimagine, or how can we now rethink ways of discussing culture instead of just defining it? Yeah,
I love it. I love it. It's this interesting moment where you have this extreme paradox of reflexivity, right? Where that, I'm thinking this, but how much of what I'm thinking is influenced by the AI, and then how much of what I want to put out there will further reinforce or not, help to reinforce a particular trope. So it's like this need for more personal reflexivity, more restraint, right? To actually understand sometimes thinking through your actions is really important. The awareness of self becomes really important.
Yeah, and I think this is why I always describe myself as a photographer who doesn't take images. because I think I realized that I've exhausted the kind of images that needs to be taken, because I feel like every image is already taken. And that's why I think for me, the action towards annotation, annotation is like supplementary information. So what are the other kinds of supplementary information that can be used to inject more context, more culture to that one static image, for example? So that becomes, I think, an important process. And in that sense, it doesn't have to be that every organization now needs like an AI expert. No, but we start to realize that this big kind of imaginary creature, this AI, is actually a continuation from a lot of the different steps that we have taken in our use of social media platforms, in terms of our image making processes, in terms of how we conduct interviews with different communities. And therefore, as organizations, to think about even when they do things like marketing and comms, right? Like, do we need another image of a starving child? All those kinds of things become is actually part of the larger discussion of AI, seeing that how it is the current technology that is shaping our lives. Yeah.
Okay, so with that, Nurul, we ask all our guests this: if you could direct people's attention to something important in the world, what would that thing be?
Yeah, this is a huge question. And I think this is something I've also been experiencing myself. I feel like empathy and patience is really, really essential in this day and age, because, things like, the neural networks, the semantic web, AI, has just increased, it has made time shorter. It has kind of increased the pace upon which we consume, we generate, that we have to think. We're reading things in bites and information that we often don't give ourselves, or we're not granting ourselves the humanity to empathize and understand people. I think because a lot of times, even for me, when I used to say that I'm an intersectional feminist, and then, oh no, wait, I'm a radical feminist now. Oh no, wait, I'm an abolitionist feminist, so like, there's all these terms or like positions that we want to take. And like, yes, I think at every point in time, it is the right decision, right? Like, yes, I'm this because of the conditions that shape me, of the experiences that have enhanced why I'm here. But I think we also need to give also room to grow, that it is possible to change your minds, which is why, I used to be a very angry person, but when I was reading my chapter on search engines, I was like, oh my gosh, it's still really bad. Like, all these images, it's still a very bad representation. But I also know that it needs time for it to be corrected, and to also understand that people can change their minds. It is okay to correct yourself. I actually correct a lot of my old artworks, because I think I did a series called Hijab Her, where I basically replicated the silhouette of the woman in hijab. And when I started looking at colonial archives, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's the same silhouette. So what I did, like 5 years later, was to correct these images by, saying like, so whenever I talk about these images, I say, you know what, when I first started this, I thought I wanted to tell stories of Muslim women. And as a young photographer, I thought this was the only way to do so. However, I'm realizing that it is not. So I think just to give ourselves the room and space to correct what would have been earlier, conceived notions of what we thought was right. And I think especially for organizations, this is something that's really hard, because for organizations it's all etched in rock, often, right? Because you're talking about your values, your missions. But I think it would be just so much more beautiful that if organizations also give themselves this space for reflexivity, because then it means that your values can stay the same, right? But like, your approach to it can become different. It can change. You can change based on how you approach people, the kind of design justice that you engage with, the kind of methods that you undertake. So all of this, I feel, are like important steps in kind of building a better world for the future, hopefully. Yeah.
That's amazing. So we usually sum up the conversation in what we picked out as 3 salient points. Of course, there are way more than 3, but I'm going to try my best. The first salient point that I picked up is really the importance of recognizing positionality, right, of oneself, of sort of how the system was constructed, who the system sort of works for, who it doesn't work for, right? So it is to recognize how pervasive, different positionalities actually have that pervasive impact on the broader system. Frame what we're utilizing as things of reference to where it comes from, but also reference them in terms of the culture that we're using it within, right? Because it's all sort of laced with power and representation. And with that, it's really critical to bring in more diversity and inclusion in how the system gets designed. So design justice, as you've just mentioned. The second point of salience is, I think, tension between representation and surveillance in this algorithmic world, this computer vision becomes really critical, right? So we have to be very careful in how we manage that balance, and that includes data stewardship, how data is stewarded, right? It's not about ownership sometimes, it's how do we steward that, because there is a lot of data. What do we add to the system? What do we not? Where is it stored? In this parameters, right? How do we create some enabling constraints for ourselves, for the system? It's not just sharing, it's what are we not sharing? So, and then the last point is just really this concept of more reflexivity that is needed. You talked about empathy and patience, and I agree. I would add to that humility, right? As you've mentioned, it's knowing that it's important to change your mind sometimes, and that sometimes that's exactly what we need. We need to correct course as we go along. So those are my 3 points of salience.
Okay, captured. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Nurul, and I had a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really a good conversation. Much needed one.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Salience Podcast. Please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Frontline Mind newsletter by visiting our website at frontlinemind.com. Have you got a topic you would like some more salience on? Send us a message on LinkedIn or email team@frontlinemind.com.